If illegal votes do decide one of those elections, the stakes for all of us are huge. Did illegal ballots cast by people like these, convicted felons who'd lost their voting rights, decide an election that changed America?
Do you think that your vote helped Al Franken get into office?
I don't know, but I hope it did.
The story begins the morning after the 2008 election. Minnesota's Republican Senator Norm Coleman thought he defeated his Democratic opponent, comedian Al Franken, and won a second term by 725 votes.
Where we are today is me being humbled and grateful for the victory that the voters gave us last night.
That was great news for Republicans. Barack Obama had defeated John McCain for the White House, but a Coleman victory over Al Franken would deny the new president a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate and free rein to enact his agenda. But Coleman's tiny margin of victory triggered an automatic recount. It also alarmed Dan McGrath. He's the executive director of the Minnesota Majority, a conservative government watchdog group. Do you think there was voter fraud in the 2008 Senate race?
I don't think there's voter fraud. I know there was voter fraud.
And so, while the official 8-month politically charged recount battle unfolded, the Minnesota Majority ran its own investigation. McGrath thought he found a smoking gun.
Convicted felons who were still on paper, still serving probation, ineligible to vote under Minnesota's Constitution, voted in large numbers in the 2008 election.
How did McGrath reach that conclusion? The Minnesota Majority compared two computer databases. The first listed people who had voted in the election. The second, people charged with felonies. That search turned up hundreds of names the Minnesota Majority suspected were felons who had voted illegally. But by then, the state Supreme Court had already declared Franken the winner by a razor-thin margin of 312 votes. But the story wasn't over for Dan McGrath, with his long list of people he suspected of voting illegally.
You had all this evidence, you gathered it together, and then who did you go to?
We brought it to the county attorneys, and under Minnesota law, the county attorney, upon receiving an affidavit alleging voter fraud, is compelled to investigate and, upon finding probable cause, to prosecute.
What happened next is one of the most extensive crackdowns on voter fraud in recent American history. Statewide, the best available evidence indicates there have been roughly 175 convictions of felons voting illegally, and another 60-plus cases are pending. You'd think Dan McGrath would be pleased. He's not.
The number of felons being convicted is not the number of felons that actually voted while they weren't supposed to. It's much higher than that.
How many felons did you find voted in that election?
According to our research, 1,000 felons participated in the election while they were ineligible to vote.
If that number is right, that's triple Franken's 312-vote margin of victory. This much is true. The actual number of felons who illegally voted is larger than the number of convictions, because you have to intend to vote illegally to be guilty. Rick Hogston is the assistant prosecutor in charge of voter fraud for the Washington County Attorney's Office. He convicted 16 people based in part on McGrath's list.
Is it possible for a felon to vote illegally, admit it, confess to it, and yet because he didn't, quote, intend to do that, they can get away with it?
Yes, it is. That's why some of our counties in Minnesota received hundreds of referrals and yet have prosecuted a relatively small number of cases.
To McGrath, that's hundreds of votes that should not have been counted.
If they weren't in the mix, what potentially could have happened?
Potentially the election could have gone to Norm Coleman.
So Al Franken, in your view, benefited from these illegal felon votes?
It looks likely. From the research that we've seen on the voting proclivity of convicted felons, it appears that it was likely to benefit Al Franken.
The race was 312 votes between Franken and Coleman. Do you think felons voting illegally could have tipped that election?
I have no way of knowing who the felons that voted unlawfully voted for.
Sue Gertner was the Ramsey County attorney, and in fact convicted 27 felons for voting illegally.
I am highly skeptical that felons voted for one candidate or another en masse.
Working off a list of those convicted of voter fraud, we went door to door.
Did you vote for Franken?
Yes, I voted for him too.
Obama and Franken?
Al Franken.
Franken.
Al Franken.
We talked to 10 of the felons convicted of voting illegally. 9 of them said they voted for Franken. It wasn't a scientific sample, but it is consistent with academic studies that found felons overwhelmingly vote Democratic. Of course, in an election so close, other factors could have tilted it one way or the other. So we wondered what the candidates in that momentous 2008 election think about this. Senator Franken declined our request for an interview. Former Senator Coleman did not.
Felons voted illegally in heavily Democratic counties. That could have turned the election.
If we dealt with the issue of felons voting, it could have turned the election. But in the end, it is what it is. And I really don't spend time fretting.
Though Coleman is philosophical, he still acknowledges the staggering difference a handful of votes could have made for all Americans.
Obamacare doesn't pass if the result of the Minnesota election is different. $850 billion stimulus package cast on a partisan vote doesn't pass if the Minnesota race is different.
He also recognizes another consequence of fraud, that it can shake citizens' faith in the system.
Voter fraud has happened in the past, and I presume it will happen in the future. But democracy flourishes because of citizens' confidence in those who represent them. And if you undermine that confidence, and it really hurts the democratic process.
Many of the most corrupt dictatorships in history have held elections. Amazingly, they always win, and almost nobody is fooled. In America, even when our system doesn't run perfectly, the overwhelming majority of voters remain confident their ballots do count. They should feel that way. But election fraud can only undermine the belief that our leaders act with the consent of the governed. Only vigilance and prudence ensure that it doesn't. I'm Eric Shawn. That's our show. Thanks for watching.